On a sunny and gorgeous Thursday afternoon, the humidity has finally gone away. It was brutally humid for the last month. But that's gone. It's a beautiful day. It's perfect weather. It's a Thursday afternoon. It's my last show of the week, last podcast of the week, and a lot to get to. Welcome on into the Bullpen. I'm your host, Adam the Bull, if you didn't know that already. If you didn't know that already, you're probably not watching, so I guess you already know it. And it's, of course, brought to you by BetRivers. If you're not using the BetRivers app, you're missing out. A lot of great things you can wager on. Major League Baseball will be back tomorrow. I think 28 of the 30 teams are back on the field tomorrow. And I'll have a Friday parlay for you out either late tomorrow morning or early tomorrow afternoon. First game back is Cubs Diamondbacks 220, and everybody else 13 other games tomorrow night. There's always tennis. You got the WNBA. So a lot to jump on and wager on at BetRivers. Now, here for the podcast, I just tweeted out a link a couple of minutes ago in which you could click on the link and join me live on the podcast to ask a question, make a comment, whatever you want to do about any subject. And you could always tweet at me, or I've got the YouTube chat room chat up. You could send me a message in there, and I will respond to your questions that way if you're a little shy about being on camera. We'll begin with the Browns. Training camp now less than 1 week away from starting. And there do remain some questions in terms of long-term extensions and a couple of players that are worth keeping an eye on here over the next few weeks. We saw this week the Browns, who have overall done a great job in the last couple of years of extending players. They did it again, this time with their kicker, Dustin Hopkins, paying him about $5 million a year for 3 years. He was on the last year of his contract. Dustin Hopkins, my first reaction with Dustin Hopkins, the signing extension, was, I don't know about guaranteeing the money to a kicker, right? Dustin Hopkins, before last year, had not been a particularly good kicker. He'd been just a guy. And then last year, he had a great year. And kickers can be very flaky. They can be good 1 year, not good the next. We've seen it all the time outside of the elite of the elite. And besides last year, Dustin Hopkins has never been in that group. But then the more you think about it, first of all, it's just more guaranteed money for this year. There is some guaranteed money for next year. Not enough that if the Browns felt like they had to move on from Dustin Hopkins after this year, they couldn't. But the real thing here is that, for the most part, Jimmy Haslam, for all his flaws, and there are a lot of them, has shown you time and time again that he will not let money stand in the way. Whether that means firing a coach and having to pay multiple or even two or even three coaches, whether it means paying a player maybe more than he's worth, at least at the time you sign him. Jimmy Haslam seems unafraid of the cap. People keep saying eventually they're going to be in cap hell. Eventually they're going to be in cap hell. They're only going to be in cap hell if there's a point where Jimmy Haslam says, I'm not going to do it anymore. It's enough. Because in football, the cap, unlike the NBA, you can, if you're willing, if the owner is willing, you can continue to kick the can down the road kind of indefinitely. That's just up to the individual owners. And to this point, Jimmy Haslam has shown no regard in terms of slowing up and not being willing to do that. Which is why, to some degree, it may be a little head-scratching that at this point they have not been able to come to an agreement with Amari Cooper and potentially JOK. There was a report from Brad Stainbrook about JOK. There hasn't been much talk about him overall. There's been a lot of conversation about Amari Cooper, and there is some concern that Amari Cooper could hold out at least through training camp. I can't imagine in the end that any player at this point is going to hold out into the season. It just doesn't really make financial sense. The last player that I can think of that did it was Le'Veon Bell, and it did not work out for him. He did become a free agent eventually. He did not sign a particularly good deal, and he never played well again. I'm not saying that would happen necessarily to Amari Cooper or anybody else. I'm just the last example did not work out well for the player. So I think even if the Browns and Amari Cooper can come to an agreement, that we will ultimately see Amari Cooper not holding out. Again, is it possible he holds out for a bit when it comes to training camp? Yeah, I guess that is possible. But anything past that, I can't imagine that that's the case. I'd be very shocked if Amari Cooper held out any further than that. But I do think that it's imperative. Well, not imperative, but I think if I'm the Browns, I would want to try to find a way to get this done. Jason Lloyd said the other day, well, it takes two to tango, obviously. And is it possible Amari Cooper's demands are above and beyond? I don't know. But as I said, Jimmy Haslam has never let money stand in his way before. I'm a little surprised that to this point that it potentially happening here. Because if Amari Cooper did hold out into the season, again, I think that's unlikely, but that's a potential disaster for the Browns because their depth chart at wide receiver after Amari Cooper is highly questionable. There is nobody proven that could be a number one receiver. I'm sure the Browns are hoping that Jerry Jeudy can develop under Amari Cooper that way, be a good number two this year, and eventually step into that number one role when Amari Cooper's gone. But that's a big if. I mean, he hasn't played anywhere close to number one receiver level in his first 4 years in the league. So, and obviously everybody else on this depth chart hasn't even played like a number two. It's a lot of young players. Elijah Moore in 3 years hasn't done much, including this 1 year with the Browns last season. And so the jury's still out on guys like David Bell and Cedric Tillman and others, but the early return's not particularly great on any of those guys. Obviously, David Bell, 2 years, not looking good at all. Cedric Tillman, not a particularly good rookie season. So Amari Cooper is imperative. The Browns are trying to win the Super Bowl this year. They're not trying to improve. I mean, you're trying to improve. You're not just the Browns don't want to be just in the mix. They want to win it all. We've talked a million times about, hey, if Deshaun Watson can play like a Pro Bowl quarterback, the Browns will have a chance to win the Super Bowl. Well, one of the things he needs to play like a Pro Bowl quarterback is at least one short thing wide receiver. And Amari Cooper is it. Amari Cooper right now is their best skill position player. It's not even close. Obviously, if Nick Chubb was 100% healthy, it's a different story. But either way, he'd be their by far best pass catcher. And right now, he's by far their best skill position player. There's not even a close second. Who would be second? I would probably. Is it Jerry Jeudy? Is it David Njoku? Is it Nick Chubb coming off an injury? I don't know. I guess I got to see Nick Chubb on the field. I lean towards him a little, but there's not a clear second choice. Jerry Jeudy, obviously, you're hoping for potential and skill, and David Njoku showed significant signs of improvement last year, but a lot of his success was with Joe Flacco at quarterback. So the combination of Deshaun Watson and David Njoku still have a ton to prove. We don't know how good Njoku is going to be because remember, the beginning of last season with Deshaun Watson, David Njoku was not off to a particularly good start. It felt like it was going to be in the beginning of the year, it kind of seemed like it was going to be another season kind of the same as every other for David Njoku. And it turned out not to be, but he played his best football with Joe Flacco. Fact is, let's go back to last year. So first 5 games for David Njoku last year, he had 19 catches for 160 yards. That's 5 games. That's not good. Then he had a couple games where he scored some touchdowns. And then he had some pretty solid games in the middle. And then by the end of the year, the last 4 games, 6 for 91, 2 touchdowns, 10 for 104 and a touchdown, 6 for 44 and a touchdown, 6 for 134. Those last 4 games, he had 4 of his 6 touchdowns, and he had, let's see, 282, 373. You know, he only had 500 yards going into the little over 500 yards going into those last 4 games. The season was kind of on the similar pace to what he'd been in the past, and those last 4 games got his numbers up to 81 catches, 882 yards, 6 touchdowns, all career highs. But until those last 4 games, he really was on pace to just be the same guy that he'd been, which is at best a 600-yard receiver with 3 or 4 touchdowns. That's what he'd mostly been. But he beat those numbers because of that great stretch. Now, we don't know what he's going to look like with Deshaun Watson. Did he have any good games with Deshaun Watson? The first game of the year, no. Then the Pittsburgh game. Baltimore game was not Deshaun. He came back. And the second Baltimore game, he had 6 for 58. In the game that Deshaun came back with that one. He had 4 for 26 and a touchdown against Arizona. He did have a touchdown there. So, yeah, not really. He didn't have any particular Seattle game wasn't Deshaun. So, obviously started the Indy game, but didn't really play that game. So in the games with Deshaun, he had, 10 for 92 and 14 for 118, 20 for 176 and a touchdown over 5 games. That's not good. So there's even if you look after the Baltimore game, his targets, through the Baltimore game, he had 9 targets in that Ravens game. He had 9 targets in the Indy game that Deshaun didn't play, 8 targets in the Seattle game that Deshaun didn't play. Then after the Baltimore game, when Deshaun didn't play the rest of the year, his targets 15, 9, 6, 8, 14, 9, 8 through the roof. It's going to be fascinating to see. Njoku, after Deshaun Watson out for the year, had at least 56 yards or a touchdown in 6 out of 7 games. After Deshaun's second injury last season. So it's really going to be interesting to see how good he is with Deshaun Watson. On the other side of the ball, JOK, coming off a magnificent 3rd season. He was a serviceable player as a rookie. He was terrible in his 2nd year, and he was phenomenal in his 3rd year. Recently, ESPN did a poll. I can't remember who was conducting this. I'm drawing a blank now, but they polled a bunch of GMs and coaches and executives, GMs and coaches, and asked for the top 10 at every position. And JOK, again, who had been terrible the year before, and you would think, I was wondering when the linebackers, when the off-ball linebackers came up there, I was like, well, how high are they going to rank? Is JOK even going to be in the top 10 based on just one season? Because he had been terrible the year before. And he was, and he finished 6th. So guys around the league believe JOK is legit, and that last year they found something real, and he's not just a one-hit wonder. So you look at the contract that Patrick Queen signed with the Steelers. I believe it was 3 years, $42 million, give or take. I think it was $14 million a year over 3. I said the other day on the UCSS, I'll say it again, I would lock up David Njoku. I'd offer him a 4-year, $60 million deal. He's a young player. He really bloomed last year in Jim Short's system. He showed a great nose for the ball. He was the only player on the defensive side that showed up in that miserable playoff game against Houston. And I know the argument's going to be, well, they haven't spent on linebackers. Well, this regime has not had any good linebackers. People brought up, or Tyvis the other day brought up Demario Davis, but which was a terrible trade by the Browns, trading him away to the Saints. But that was not this regime. This current regime hasn't had any good linebackers. They haven't done a particularly good job with linebackers, but they did with JOK. And in year 3, they got it right. He's got 1 year left on his contract. Seems to me the Browns, who, as I said, outside of the Amari Cooper situation, especially with young players, have generally done a magnificent job of being able to extend these guys. And I think it's a no-brainer to lock JOK up, even if it's a lot of money to a position, most people don't want to pay a ton of money to. But if JOK is the 6th best linebacker, off-ball linebacker in football, which he very, very well may be, maybe he gets even better. There's a part of me that's worried about a little bit of a regression from him, but I think it's just as likely that we could see him get even better. Now that he's second year in the system, second year with Jim Schwartz, goes into a whole off season of confidence. He couldn't have been confident going into last year, coming off that 2022 season. But right now, he's got to be starting the season with a ton of confidence because he played great. And now everybody believes in him. Everybody thinks he's good. So, we'll see. The one and only TW says Njoku 100%. In answer to who is the second best skill position player on the Browns. Yeah, I mean, you could make a case for Njoku. You can make a case for Jerry Jeudy. You can make a case for Nick Chubb. I guess with Nick Chubb, it just depends what you believe. I mean, in the end, at some point, I would think Nick Chubb at least gets close to the player he was. By the end of the year, it wouldn't surprise me if Nick Chubb was back to being a top 5 running back. Will he be that in the beginning of the season? Seems unlikely, coming off as serious a knee injury as he had. And if it was almost any other player, I'd say no chance. But we know what kind of freak Nick Chubb is, and I'm never going to bet against him. We saw him. We all love watching the squatting videos from Nick Chubb. And the other day, he's squatting like 650 pounds, whatever the hell it was. It was crazy. So by the end of the season, I wouldn't bet against him. But, I mean, I think Njoku is a fair bet. But again, he's got to show he could do it over a whole season. He has not had a whole season where he's been consistently good. And he's got to prove, along with Watson, that they can do it together. I think that's kind of been ignored here a little bit, that most of his success came without Deshaun Watson. And now we have to see them hook up together. And there's no reason why it can't work. There's nothing intrinsically wrong in that relationship. It's not like these guys have a bad relationship or Deshaun Watson doesn't want to throw him the ball. There's also a new offensive coordinator. It does appear that Ken Dorsey is going to call the plays. So I'll be curious from that perspective, how much does the tight end get used? In Buffalo, they had oh my God, I can't think of his name. The one tight end that they had there for a while, and then they drafted a kid, Dalton Kincaid, last year, who was really good as a rookie. Although he did play his best after Dorsey was gone. But to be fair, he was a rookie, so it may just be a coincidence. But they have another tight end there, a veteran, and the name is Dallas Knox. I think that's it. Is that it? I think it is. Now I got to look it up because it's going to drive me crazy. But and he's not anything special. But Dawson Knox, not Dallas Knox. Okay, I knew Dallas Knox sounded wrong to me. He's a guy who, not a great player, but he put up some pretty decent numbers. He put up kind of David Njoku kind of numbers before the last year. The 2 years before that, he had 587 yards, 9 touchdowns, 517, and 6 touchdowns. It's about where David Njoku was yardage-wise, not the touchdowns, 15 touchdowns. So obviously, in 21 and 22, with a tight end not as talented as David Njoku, Dawson Knox was targeted quite a bit, especially in the red zone, because he had 15 touchdowns in 30 games between 2021 and 2022. That's a lot. A half a touchdown a game for a, mediocre skilled tight end is pretty interesting. Thank you, Albert. I did come up with Dawson Knox. Well, I came up with it once I looked it up. But so it's just another aspect of the offense that we're just not sure about. We know that the Browns have talent. They have a new offensive line coach, and they have a new running backs coach. And you've brought a couple of other running backs into the mix here with D'Onta Foreman and Nyheim Hines. It was funny. I was listening to some show on the fantasy sports channel. And I love the fantasy sports channel, even though half the shows there are terrible, but some of them are really good. If that makes me a nerd, I can live with it. But one of the guys was talking about drafting Nick Chubb late. And I agreed with him. I thought it made a lot of sense because by the second half of the year, Nick Chubb could be a difference maker from not only an NFL perspective, but also from a fantasy football perspective. But then he proceeded to say, well, the Browns didn't add any running backs. It's just Jerome Ford. I'm like, what? They added 2 running backs. Now, I don't know how much Nyheim Hines is going to play on offense. He missed all of last season, so he's coming off an injury. He's older than Nick Chubb. He may be more of a specialist, the guy they're going to use in the return game. He was, in the past, a particularly good pass catcher, third down type of back, and they might use him in that role. But I don't know that we'll see him much on offense. I think early in the season, I mean, if Nick Chubb is ready to go, we're not going to see Nyheim Hines at all. I mean, he'll be the fourth back, but the special teams guy. If Nick Chubb is not ready to go in the beginning of the season, we could see him a little bit. But, I mean, between Jerome Ford and D'Onta Foreman, I don't know how much you're using Nyheim Hines. Now, D'Onta Foreman is a between-the-tackles runner. He's not catching a lot of passes generally. But Jerome Ford, we saw it last year. He can be dangerous in the passing game. And if Nick Chubb is not ready, or if they need to ease him along slowly in the beginning, I would think we'd see a mix of D'Onta Foreman and Jerome Ford. Ford did a decent job last year. I mean, he was serviceable. He was not anywhere close to Nick Chubb, but he was serviceable, and he had his moments. But it could be a situation where we see, again, D'Onta Foreman is the second down back, and Jerome Ford is the third down back. Either way, I just don't think that, unless there's injuries, which of course are always possible, that we'll see much of Nyheim Hines in the offense. But it is a complicated backfield situation, at least until Nick Chubb is ready to go full blast. Which, again, could potentially be in the beginning of the year. You never know when it comes to Nick Chubb. Anything is possible. So there's still a lot of storylines and things to watch. And in terms of, we've kind of talked about on the podcast on UCSS about, will Deshaun Watson play in the preseason? How much will he play? He did say yesterday he was good to go for the start of training camp next week. And they're going to go to Greenbrier, obviously, like they did last year. It was a really good experience for the team, and so they're going to do it again. They have the Vikings coming to town at some point for a couple days of scrimmage. But how do you balance getting Deshaun Watson some reps in the preseason, the risk of injury, versus yet another month where rust is building? I mean, Deshaun Watson has thrown so few passes in the last 3 years that has played a factor. It's a factor. I mean, think about it. In 2020, Deshaun Watson threw 544 passes. In 3 years, his 3 full years in Houston, 505, 495, 544. So the minimum is 495 over 3 years. In the last 3 years, 2021, 2022, 2023, Deshaun Watson has thrown 341 passes. So he's essentially thrown about, 2/3 of a season worth of passes over 3 years. it shouldn't be surprising that the numbers aren't good. That a guy who had been a 68% completion percentage, which is fantastic, in Cleveland has been under 60%, which is terrible. In Houston, he threw 104 touchdowns and 36 interceptions. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio. In Cleveland, 14 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. That's less than 1.5 to 1. All the numbers across the board are worse. And part of it is because he hasn't been healthy. Part of it is probably mental hurdles he through 2 years has not been able to completely overcome. But the biggest part of it is the rust, the lack of playing time, and the bottom line for me, and I think I may have said in the past that he's not going to play in the preseason or he shouldn't play. If you're so scared to throw him in for 1 or 2 possessions in the preseason, if you're that worried about him getting hurt, then he's not going to make it through the season anyway. So I've kind of changed my mind on this, and I think Deshaun Watson should play at least a little bit in the preseason, probably the second game. We'll see if they do that. All right, if you want to jump in, I tweeted out the link about 30 minutes ago. If you want to jump in, be live on camera. If not, you can send a message in the chat. You can send a message on Twitter as well, if you want. One other thing I wanted to hit on real quick before we wrap things up, too. The Guardians back in action tomorrow. I mentioned right at the beginning that baseball's back tomorrow, and I'll have a parlay for you tomorrow. I've got my eye now. The draft is behind us. The All-Star game behind us. You got 67 games, or the Guardians have 67 games left on the season. So we're 2 weeks away from the 2/3 point, and we are 12 days away from the trade deadline. I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. The Guardians must be aggressive. This is the year, and every media member that covers the Guardians agree. They have to be aggressive financially. They have to be aggressive in terms of trading prospects. They cannot live in their fears. This is the chance. The Guardians are right there. They have the best record in the American League, better than big money Baltimore, bigger than crazy money Yankees. The you want to say, well, the Guardians struggled the last couple of weeks. So did the Yankees, even worse. The Orioles did not play particularly well. Guardians took 2 out of 3 from them. There is no dominant team in the American League. I think the best team in baseball is the Phillies, and I think the Guardians are as good as anybody else. I believe that, and I think they can win the World Series. But they need some reinforcements. They need a minimum of 1 starting pitcher. I'd get 2. I would get another good relief pitcher, and I would get at least 1 more bat. In a perfect world, they'd get 2 more bats, 2 more starters, and a good reliever. That's not going to happen. In a reasonable world, 2 starters, including 1 who's just an innings eater, and 1 hitter. But minimum, 1 starting pitcher. But I really think they need to do more. Marshall sends a message in the YouTube chat. Need a pitcher or going to get smoked in the playoffs? They do. They do. They might not get smoked in the first round, but I think it's going to be very hard for them in the playoffs if they don't get at least 1 more starter. That's a huge difference. Their bullpen is excellent. Their lineup is good. Their defense is excellent. Their base running is excellent. Their starting pitching is bad. Well, it's below average. It's not good enough. They need to improve it. It's that simple. All right, thanks for all who watched today. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Please like as well. Thanks to Max and Monzo for producing. I'll be on the Ultimate Cleveland Guardian show tomorrow. I will have a new podcast on Monday as well. And then I'm going on vacay for a week. And then after that, it's full bore into football. So there'll be a lot to get to. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching. Again, please subscribe, whether it's on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Pods or wherever you're checking out the podcast. I appreciate the support. We'll talk to you next time. Where else but right here in the Bullpen with Adam the Bull, brought to you by Bet Rivers. See you, everybody.